forgot to record. The idea was not so much simply to present the text as we did it in the first time, but also discuss it in a way that we could like see further steps. Because I think that one thing that we got to see while this text was being written, and I don't know the degree of reading that you all were able to do on the text, but I think that one thing that was very interesting in the text was how it clearly made appear a lot of undeveloped problems and elements in the global STP theory, and how it's not, it's at the same time it's very easy, not easy, but there's some many possible straight lines out of the main elements in the text that would allow for its application development in distinct areas. For example, the text, as most of you might remember, is structured in three parts. It's rather asymmetrical, but there's one that deals with world systems theory, a second one that deals with real abstraction, the Zonrethelian kind, and the third one which deals more directly with STP's own thoughts, which are related to the problems of what are atoms, what is a social atom, what is the logics of social worlds, what are these worlds, what are the spatial aspects of this world from the idea of atoms, what are the temporal elements of these worlds from the atoms, and what would be a sort of philosophy of history that could be developed, deduced from these starting points. And what I think became very clear, and it was something that we had, I think, to stop ourselves from developing too much. This was present, I think, especially in the discussions that Dennis started fleshing out about, for example, what would be the definition of social in this aspect. What would be the difference, for example, between survival, between life and the social life? These points entered the text, but they were not so fully developed. But they showed, I think, how much space, how much room there is to grow from elements in this text, specifically from chapters 5 to, I don't know, 16. I don't remember how many parts it had in the end. But for example, it was also very, it was something that we were able to see, for example, how a theory of language was able to also be thought out from these aspects. But these are things that still need to be developed. But I think that if we get a collective reading of this text, absorption of his theses, it will be better for the group in general for these eventual fleshing outs of these undeveloped issues in this text. So I think Gabriel was kind enough to share with us his PowerPoint presentation that he prepared for his lecture on Oxford. Very fancy. It's finishing, I think, right about now. Did anybody get to see it? Did anybody here get the participate in the? Was it paid? Well, either way, I think that we could use that as a guiding thread to present and discuss the issues in the text. So I think that's like the idea for the meeting. I don't know what you guys think, but I think the general idea was getting people acquainted with the ideas in the text. So I'm just going to get the. Yeah, it was only in person. Oh, okay, so I thought there was an online event. Let me just share.
Yeah, I think there's another event on the 4th in Beirut. That one may be online.
Mm. Oh, yes, yes. Okay, so this is well,
The Beirut event is on the same topic as the one today.
Yes, I think so.
yeah, from what I remember, I think he was presenting on the logics of social worlds. Maybe he will put different emphasis on them, but from what I recall, it was the same topic. Yeah, so I think he focused, yeah. He skipped I think the discussion on the real atoms, but I think we can go from there if we on the social real abstraction and world systems theory. But I think we can just like recall very quickly, and I don't know if people want to interrupt, want to interject or whatever. I think it's better than just like a unilateral presentation. But I think that the main issue of the text, and this is like something we struggle to get the point clear for how this text would be structured, was related to the fact that there was a demand or an offer that we would be able to present a paper, an essay on relating real abstraction for the book on real abstraction that Caron is also contributing with an essay, the real abstraction and the given. And Caron was able to get us an invite as a group to contribute with a paper on real abstraction and world systems theories, with the idea that these are both very different theories that are up to this point treated in very different forms, where it's not very easy to see a possible form of interacting between them. And I think for our purposes, this was an opportunity, because in a sense, the discussions done by world systems theory and by real abstraction, the Zonrettelian real abstraction, they both of them in different ways, I think, contribute to our more general form of looking at uh, social forms, social organizations, etc. So at first we were very lost on how to deal with this. We thought about comparing real abstraction and world systems theory, and then we decided that this was not very good, because we would probably be having to we would probably have to point missing elements in some of those theories, which would probably not, they would probably not be very welcomed if we were like, we would be attracting, I think, unwanted attention and starting discussions about the merits of world systems theories or the merits of real abstractions, when in fact, and I think this is something that became clear as we continued our discussions, this is not a problem in real abstraction per se, or problems in world systems theory per se, but problems that appear from the point of view that STP arrives at the problem of social domination and social emancipation. So with that in mind, and I think this will cover the second and third part of the of the essay, we we started with this diagram that has 4 different combinations of conjunctural and structural in regards to domination and emancipation. And in a sense, the idea was that this diagram, it allowed us to see 4 different approaches to the problem of the relation between domination and emancipation. We struggled a lot with how we were going to call these names, but I think in the end, we were able also to understand that the problem of emancipation and domination, the main issue that concerns us is having a theory that allows us to understand the relations between them, and how you posit these terms and how you posit these relations, they end up having very different consequences for the social theory at hand. So, for example, just so we can start from where we started our essay, when we look at the first pair, conjunctural domination and conjunctural emancipation, I think the first thing that we have to have clear here is that we are talking about world systems theory in the sense that what is at hand, what matters here is being able to identify the concrete structures of domination. For example, the concrete structures that compose the division of the world into core, periphery, semi-periphery, or different constructions depending on the stage of the world system. But what's important, I think, is that domination here is treated in very concrete terms. So the element that is like being described, the structure of domination, in a sense, it is treated as real entities, concrete entities that, in a sense, they exist in the world. They can be mapped. They can be linked through, for example, trade routes, through bureaucratic structures, through legal entities, through different groups that exert domination on other groups. So, for example, the core and then the colonized peripheries. So, in a sense, does anyone want to say something, or? Oh, it's just Michael. When we talk about conjunctural domination, it's very important to see that there's like we are producing descriptions of a structure of domination through fixed terms that are pinpointable in the world. And the emancipation aspects, so the way in which you free yourself from this domination, it will also be treated in the same terms. So, for example, we will talk about third worldism will be an answer to this conjunctural domination, or certain forms of resistance in the periphery to the core periphery relation will be pinpointed also by concrete groups that can be localized, that can be specified. So I think that the important aspect that we have to retain here is that we have 2 things. First, I don't know if I can do this because I'm not how do you do the maybe? So we have to, you can see very clearly here that this is like a fixed, these terms, they are fixed. The terms, okay, this is not very good. But the terms of the conjunctural domination, they are and the terms of the conjunctural emancipation, they are fixed terms. They are related to concrete entities, but the relation between domination and emancipation is an abstract relation in the sense that it is an immanent relation between the terms. There's a homogeneity between the elements that are conducting domination and the elements that are fighting for emancipation, in a sense that we have. Oh, sorry, is it my internet? Is it cutting a lot? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
No, it
maybe.
doesn't. I think it is Renzo's because
Sorry. Okay.
Okay,
earlier
same.
Renzo was talking. His voice was choppy.
Okay, so from what no problem. So from what we see in this first quadrant here, we have fixed terms, concrete terms that are defined, but the relation between domination and emancipation, it can be described as immanently defined. But wait, just 1 second. It can be immanently defined in the sense that they're not predefined. For example, the dominating, there's no like fixed definition of what it would be to relate, because in fact the terms they relate to each other in a homogeneous manner. This point will become clear when we look at the second quadrant between structural domination and conjunctural emancipation, which we have identified, especially with value form theorists, with special focus on Zonretto. When we have structural domination here, we are talking about a description of domination that focuses on the abstract aspects of domination, the forms, the structural form of domination, and not on the concrete actors themselves. So in a sense, we have like these ideas, for example, the automatic structure of capital as an automatic subject, all those forms of describing value form and its dominance. And in opposition to that, we have forms of emancipation that are described as attempting to undo this abstract character of capital, to undo these automating these forms of domination, and these elements of emancipation, they would thus be, in a sense, things that undo these abstract structures that dominate. So, for example, we could see that the passage from domination to emancipation in this second quadrant is not something that goes without, it's a very clear passage. Not only is there like a structural domination, which is, for example, which is simply, it's not defined through certain actors, but actually through a form that defines the fixed points. And yes, Postone's analysis would be one of the best examples of this, in the sense that the way that you fight this structure of value is destroying value form, in a sense. I think the most radical or clear idea of this maybe is the Cursian way, or we could even say that any type of social theory that attempts to describe the normative structures of capital and that sees freeing from capital's domination, of freeing from normativity, I think that could be fit in the second quadrant. That's why it does not it seeks to replace the abstract forms of domination with insurrections, with revolts, anything that in a sense stops the machine. This was not described in the group, but this is an image that comes to me many times because of listening to many of Paulo Arantes' lectures, the Brazilian critical theorist that is very dear to many of us here from Brazil, is that the image of fighting, of revolting for him, it's always pictured in a very in a form that is described by he says that it's Bernstein's position. I wouldn't know. I'm not a Marxist historian, but he describes that our only task, he is also a Benjaminian, so that can be seen from that point of view. Our task is to hamper the wheels of capital. So instead of in dealing with these automatic structures that desubjectify us, that dehumanize us, what we have to do is put a stop to them. So a structural domination is opposed by a conjunctural emancipation. So what I think is clear from this point of view is that there is like a very clear, a fixed relation between domination and emancipation. There is no homogeneity between forms of domination and forms of emancipation, as we see in the form in the first quadrant. What we have here is a very fixed form of relation. Emancipation is freeing yourself from structures of abstraction, from these structures that dominate life. These were so we treat that in the text, especially through the discussion on real abstraction and world systems theory. There's a third quadrant that we do not treat in the text, and this is something that we can that I think was not, it's treated actually in the end of the text, where we have the inverse of the second quadrant, where instead of having a structural domination and conjunctural emancipation, we have conjunctural domination and structural emancipation. This would be the Jacobin point of view, the leftist Enlightenment position. It was also associated to accelerationism, to Negrianism, some forms of operaismo, if I recall correctly. But the idea is that we are dominated by conjunctural structures that can very well assume the form of personal structures of domination that are not reasonable. They are, on quite the contrary, they are very much arbitrary in their forms of exerting power. And the way of emancipating ourselves from these conjunctural forms of domination, so from these specific entities, specific forms, specific groups that exert domination, is through the development of abstract structures that free us. So we can fit, for example, here the whole left, even if that's not something that's really existent anymore these days, whatever was once called left accelerationism, the Williams and Cernicek point of view of like refocusing the powers of capital in name of leftist politics, these would fit in this third quadrant. And I think what's clear here that we can now, like, I think, view more clearly, and which allows us also to see where we would fit in, is that points to the second and third quadrant. They have each one of the terms is structural. So in a sense, when we say structural, we mean that it's in a sense it's not defined through fixed points, but certain relations are what make these fixed points appear. So in a sense, the structure of capital in the second quadrant is what determines the elements that compose these relations. In the third quadrant, the structure of like enlightened communist reason, it's not predetermined by any specific group or form of action. It's something that's rationality developing its own best practices, in a sense, we might say. And we have one pole which is relationally defined, and the other pole that is defined through the terms. So in the third quadrant, the forms of domination are specific forms of domination. And these specific forms of domination are fought, or we free ourselves from them through the going from the conjunctural to the structural. So as you can see, the second and third quadrants, they share the same principle in the sense that they see the movement from domination to emancipation as a movement between fixed points and immanent points. So abstraction and concreteness. So differently from the first point, where the relation is homogeneous between domination and emancipation, where there is like a fighting fire with fire, in the second and third quadrant, we have a relation between these two elements that is already predetermined. So what is good in the second quadrant is like Adornism, like reason is bad. Like I'm of course doing a caricature here, but the pathologies of reason must be fought. So, and in the end, we have to get away from any form of automatic reasonable structures, because they tend to oppress man. While in the third quadrant, it's quite the opposite. Impersonal forms of power, they are nothing but unreasonable. So the way to emancipate would be through reason. So as you can see, there is already, in certain sense, the flow of history is predefined over here in quadrants 2 and 3. While in quadrant 1, we have a relation between domination and emancipation that is not defined previously. They are defined through their relations. And this would take us to the fourth quadrant, which is what we explore in our essay, especially from chapters.
Sorry,
5.
Rafael, just
Sorry.
a question.
Sure.
I understand the logic and the this harmony between quadrant 2 and 3, but can you explain how accelerationism fits into quadrant 3? How accelerationism is looking to fight through raising formal structures in order to annihilate the form of specific dominations?
Well, I think that first it would be, we would have to like get out of the way the idea that when we are talking, I think here about accelerationism, we are talking here about what is mostly left accelerationism. So if we take other forms of accelerationism, such as Nick Land or such, we could very well put him on he wouldn't fit in these quadrants because he's not a leftist thinker. His point goes from conjunctural domination to structural domination. I think that's what his point of view would be. We need to find better forms of annihilating ourselves. What I think that allows us to take accelerationism as an example of what allows us to take accelerationism, left accelerationism, as an example of going from conjunctural domination to structural emancipation. I think it would be precisely the wager on the fact that reason or rationality or normative structures in general are forms of freeing and not forms of domination. So, for example, this is something that is not discussed or developed here, but I think, and it's a pity that Caron is not here today, but it might be possible to say that, for example, the wager on rationality, on the construction of forms of reason, on the expansion of the space of reason through institutions, it would, in a sense, allow us to escape from arbitrary forms of domination that may present a limited view on what rationality might be. So, in a sense, I think there's an inverted idea here that, and that's why I think it opposes to the quadrant two. I may not be answering fully the question, but I think that in a sense, leftist accelerationism and the idea of, for example, cybersyn, which is something that they inherit, I think, quite openly, would be the wager that there are forms of organizing social structures that get us away from forms of domination that might appear natural, but once they are put in opposition to these more rational forms of organizing society through the distribution of resources, etc., it reveals itself to be a personal form of organization and not simply an impersonal form of domination. Of course, and I think this is important, if we start to nitpick these definitions, not these definitions, but these examples, it's quite possible that we may find that, for example, there are some elements of accelerationism that seem to take for granted the structural domination aspect. But I think there is a difference, and a difference that appears, I think, only from our point of view, from accelerationism, which is why I don't think accelerationism would be in quadrant 4, is because, in a sense, it seems that there is one rationality, I would say. There's not what I think we get to see in STP's position is that when we go from structural domination to structural emancipation, we have multiple forms of rationality. So I think Renzo put something here that I think is important. I don't know. Do you want to comment, Renzo, or you're fine with just?
Yeah, no comment. I was just trying to make sense of and I think the although I'm not sure I fully understand the operators, some of them I think are quite helpful to make sense. And then
No, please.
No, yeah, I was just I was going through the way that you sort of like opposed into like I mean, what's interesting is that the structural conjunctural part, like pair, is sort of is in each case is sort of like sort of reconfigure into a different sort of like pair that does the work, right? So in one case, reason on the third case, reason is on the side of emancipation, and then reason becomes the conjunctural factor. And that's different from the two where the sort of systemic structural property is opposed by a sort of like not irrational, but a destructive critical force. And yeah, I was also thinking it was interesting to sort of like distinguish. I was trying to make sense of the difference between 3 and 4, which sort of reminded me of how 3 sort of like vibes with utopian like socialism, in the sense that some sort of like project of what, you know, like communism would be is sort of like proposed, but in a way that's sort of like discontinuous with the concrete situations. While I think a good point of difference with our approach is that although our sort of like approach is in a sense it might feel like propositive in a sense of like it's not, because it's the regionalization is not about sort of like going out through a project, but sort of like going out through this sort of like localizing particular forms into like more general structures, and this is done in a continuous manner. So the homogeneity between structure and structure in four, I think is a good point of distinction from tree. And I was wondering if in the sort of like Carmenist tradition, there's a name for like a political tendency that sort of like emphasize that. And yeah, that's it.
I don't think it's very the idea of the operators that you put there is very good, because it's exactly that. We have like the operators of power, of the not power, but of domination. I think we could say like the type of fetish specific to each type of structure is very clear. The point one, in the first point one, what is hidden are the concrete actors that are doing the domination. And once you are able to see them, you are also able to fight them, because the form of emancipation is of the same term as the form of domination. The relation between structural domination and conjunctural domination and emancipation is a bit more nuanced, in the sense that it is not enough to identify, for example, that the fetish of value. It's not simply a matter of, it's not fetishization as demystification, but as it's structurally the ability to identify the whole system that is responsible for creating even that twofold structure. I think that's Postone's point, at least, that twofold structure in commodities. But when we take to points 3 and 4, which I think are very similar in a sense, and I think that when you put like utopian socialism as the end game, for example, of the third quadrant, I think it's very clear, even though it's something that's not really it's something that I won't know. I don't know how much it's due to my ignorance. I don't know how much it is discussed, but it's always seems to be the point that is the most vulnerable to decolonial or post-structuralist critiques or anthropological critiques, in the sense that there is a wager on the fact that there is only one type of rationality, and that it is possible for this form of emancipation to be self-consistent, in a sense. I don't know if that's like if that's something you would agree with, but I think that the main difference is that when you start from the idea that social logics, there's not one social logic. It's not possible for a social logic to be consistent by itself. I think that the result is that you see that this multiplicity of social logics must be already present, in a sense, in the domination. Because if there is one form of logic, if there's one type of rationality only, either you have it or you don't. So if emancipation is a structural aspect and there's only one form of rationality, there's one utopia, then what we see in reality is the lack of this reason, right? So I think that this difference might be from the differentiating point between 3 and 4 in terms of structural domination might be a differentiation in regards to the consistency of the logic of emancipation. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's but I don't know if there's an I mean, we've just found ourselves in mode D once more. I don't
Can
know
I ask in a long form question?
please.
Something. Because it seems like that, like, the one has, and I think you mentioned this at some point, or maybe it was in the paper, that it has an empirical kind of flavor to it, and that there's this strange kind of way that even though both of the positions are kind of abstract, it ends up being more kind of fact oriented than 2 or 3, which do kind of both require some kind of like speculation or some kind of like jump between the levels because of the difference there. And it does seem like there's this strange way that both 2 and 3 almost kind of like backslide in a way. They both kind of like that the gap between structure and conjuncture ends up being a place where like fantasies end up forming. Where in a weird, like, the number 1 position reminds me in a strange kind of way of dealing with like Trotskyists or some like Wobblies or other groups that have like a lot of fidelity to like an old way of doing things, but like are really into doing, like, digging up all the ways to keep being loyal to that in some form or another. And a lot of their works tend to be like highly like, we're like with the demystification idea, like, we're going to lay out all the facts of the situation, we're going to tell you exactly who the bad guys are, and in that way it's going to clarify, but we're also going to lay out all the good guys, we're going to explain exactly what they did, and that's going to clarify to us how we should act in the present, right, by kind of archaeologically recovering our own tradition, our own past. And kind of coming from starting politics in the Occupy period, I found a lot of like I found it really refreshing coming to like Trotskyists and Wobblies and others after a lot of politics that were very informed by 2 or 3, a lot of imminent critique kind of stuff, or accelerationism and various other kind of utopianisms or what have you. And I'm wondering if there's a connection between 4 and 1 in that sense, that like 4 is what enables us to kind of finally come back to being able to position all those facts, but without the kind of mistake of so many of these other traditions, which seems to be that you can kind of like simply repeat the past and the present. I think that traversing 2 and 3 gets us to the problem of like, by the time we get to 4, we realize repetition is not something that's so simple. And I'm wondering if that's a fair interpretation, and B, if like 2 and 3 do have a more like utopian tendency than 1.
Well, I think in regards to an utopian tendency, I would say that it's a weird utopia, I think, because on 2, but I understand your point if we're saying that, for example, there is a very clear structure there's a very clear philosophy of history that you can discern from 2 and 3, in the sense that you either go towards a more rational society, or you leave a more rational society when you identify that rationality with oppression. And the first one, in a sense, it seems to be the most, and this is like just me editorializing, but it seems to me that the first quadrant, from a more like from a first look, it can seem to be the most simple, because in a sense, as you said, I mean, it's not a matter of of like understanding social reality as a set of abstractions that compose a certain world. For example, when we see quadrant 2, value form theories, value is not something that you can destroy by simply smashing certain institutions or making them weaker. It's not something that will affect these sorts of relations. So in a sense, there's the idea that it's a simpler form of describing domination, but the simple form of describing domination retains a complexity that I think it's only visible in the long term, in the sense that what quadrant 1 gets right and what becomes clear when we see it through quadrant 4s is that when you keep a homogeneity between domination and emancipation, it seems as if there is a point of struggle, right? It seems like there is a specific place where you can act, and that action will either increase, weaken or strengthen domination, weaken or strengthen emancipation. When you deal with abstract forms of domination or an abstract promise of emancipation, we are back in the problem of participation, in the sense that where, how, through what forms are you going to make this rationality interact with these sensible, concrete elements? So how do you explain that? I think that is why these two quadrants, I don't know if this is making sense, John. Please stop me if I'm spiraling out of control. But these two quadrants, in a sense, they seem to be more dependent on a philosophy of history as a fixed point that allows the passing from domination to emancipation, which is a problem that the first quadrant does not have. So, I mean, for the Hegelians in the room, it does seem that the fourth quadrant, in a sense, is a sort of return to the first quadrant, but a return that is only possible once we are able to see that domination has structural aspects and that emancipation has also structural aspects, in the sense that emancipation, and I think it's easier to see, maybe it's from where I'm coming from, the discussions that I've been around, but it's easier to see, I think, the second quadrant from the third quadrant, because the third quadrant, it seems to be even more dependent on a philosophy of history, in the sense that you have to bet that reason will come out of a lack of reason of social structures. And it also seems to, in a sense, leave unaddressed some points, which is the fact that what is identified as conjunctural domination, if we take, for example, the 68ers, what was one of the main issues that we find, for example, in Deleuze, Guattari, and all those people, and I think which leads them to an impasse in the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, at least from these two perspectives, is that the fact that it's very weird because these forms of domination, they are able to incorporate rationalities that are developed and deployed when you're thinking about structural emancipation. So some of the some rational demands, for example, they can be very easily incorporated in forms of domination. And I think that would only be possible if there was, in a sense, some certain rationality in domination. If there are already structural, abstract forms that organize the domination, and if domination is not simply some terms, some specific points that exert oppression, that dominates arbitrarily, etc. I don't know. May have lost myself in the way. But just so we can carry on, so in a sense, we have here like a synthesis. The first quadrant is to preserve the methodological principle that there must be a homogeneity between description and prescription. So as we see, there is an attempt to describe social theory in a way that the elements of domination are of the same type as the elements of emancipation. But they drop the precedence of terms of relation that gives world systems theory its empiricist overtones. So we can see that from the first quadrant, what we keep is the homogeneous elements between emancipation and domination, between description and prescription, between the descriptive aspects and the normative aspects of a social theory. From the second quadrant, what is preserved is the concern with formal conditions for particular processes to acquire social effectivity. So there's here the attempt to borrow, and I think, John, this addresses some of the aspects you were talking about. There is a very important aspect here where we keep the attention to the immanent structures that have a social effectivity. They are not simply some actors, but those actors are who they are through certain processes that actually define them. From the third quadrant, what is preserved is the interest in the emancipatory potential of social mediations in search for large-scale systemic alternatives. So we do not since we dropped the romantic and tragic view of political practice that leads, for example, I think this is something that we've all seen in one way or another, a certain allergy to organization, to any form of governance, it's too quickly associated to Stalinist practices, to authoritarian practices, to totalitarian practices, etc. Well, what goes away from that, and which is a sort of a remedy, is the emancipatory potential of social mediations in the search for large-scale systemic alternatives. So the idea of structural emancipation is that social mediations, abstract mediations, they are not simply things that dehumanize us, but there is a potential for social emancipation through them. But they drop we drop the dependence on underlying and converging historical change towards something, and the stages take on privileged social systems. So I think this is like the utopian socialism that Renzo pointed out. I think that what's the main problem with the third quadrant is the fact that since it sees the previous world as conjunctural forms of domination and social mediation as a step to emancipation, it is only able to see if social mediation is a form of emancipation, it's only able to see the forms of domination as, in a sense, arbitrary and personal forms of domination. So when you go through these three steps, they don't have to be steps, right? But it's more clear how certain distinctions allow us to take into account the fact that, first, the relation between domination and emancipation has to be treated through a homogeneity principle, which is what we gained from world systems theory. There is a theory of real abstractions that we can take from the second quadrant, which is, for example, the concern of understanding that if there is a social effectivity of capitalism, if it is a form of domination, then there is a logic that explains this domination. So Zonretto, for example, is one of the is a guiding thread in a sense, because he's one of the people who treated capitalism, as Poston and many other value form theorists, as something that emerges from a certain logic. But, and I think this is like where we, this is where we, yeah, I think this makes sense, at least from a pedagogical sense, because I don't know if if we were like, when we have STP for kids, I think the first step would be to present it. It would be very easy to ask people, if you ask people, who dominates who? What is freeing yourself from domination? You would start from a concrete view of domination and a concrete view of emancipation. You have the good guys, you have the bad guys, but then you see that the good guys, they are the system. So that's like when you relativize domination is when you are a youngling and you watch Watchmen, for example, right? You watch Watchmen, and then you see that why aren't the good guys able to fight the bad guys? Why you do that? But why does that happen? Because it's not a problem of a concrete domination. It's an abstract form of domination that constructs a certain world. 1, 2 relativizes domination, Renzo. Because the second quadrant is structural domination. Right?
Wait, yeah, but so it relativizes the conjuncture, right? Because moving from oh, no,
Yeah,
wait,
yeah. At
let me
least
think
that's what I
about it.
was.
Oh, okay. I think I was interpreting the opposite sense of relativizing, in the sense that in two you get a single form of domination, so it's absolute in a sense. It's not contingent, so it's not being relativized domination. And in three you have a relativization of domination in the sense that it is a sort of like irrational concrete force, while but now I see what you mean.
No, but I think that there's this point where, and I think there might be a question of how you go from 1 to 2, how you go from 1 to 3, and how it's not enough to be in 2 and 3, that you have to go back to 1 to reach 4. Because in a sense, when you go from we could like, this could be like an essay, because when you go from conjunctural domination to structural domination, you do that through a deficit on the power of emancipation, right? Like, at least that's what I'm thinking. I mean, you start looking structurally when it's not enough to deal with these actors. Yeah, Yeah, that's yeah, but conjuncture there in a different sense. But yeah, I think so, Vitor. I think you know it's structural because the situation hasn't changed. But then there's also another path where, and I think there are simultaneous paths that you can go also to the other way, which is you can see that emancipation is not a matter of, because you can either know the domination is not structural, or you can know is not conjunctural, or you can know that the emancipation is not conjunctural. And then you go to the other position. For because at least that's how I see it. But I do think that like this is one of the things that are, wait, damn, I think this is one of the points that is underdeveloped in the essay, because this was like this was the form of binding of the essay itself. This is what allowed us to get a point of view where we were able to treat real abstraction and world systems theory without shitting on any of them. And that leads us to the logics of social atoms, which is like where we start developing more closely the I think the precise STP element of this text. So do we do a break here before we start? Yeah, I think I also agree, Ren. I think there's like there's a lot of value in them, especially when we are concerned with talking with other organizations. Because, for example, if we are like if there are organizations talking between themselves, they can also talk past themselves, because they are in a sense viewing the pair of domination and emancipation in different forms. So I think that what the fourth quadrant allows is a way to understand which types of translations are necessary so that all these different approaches that organizations have to how they can talk between each other without talking past each other. Because like it's very, this is like a, I don't know if this makes sense for you guys, but for example, we have this very we have this issue here in Brazil right now, which is we have a leftist government, and this government, it's occupying state power, so it can do a lot of things, but there are also a ton of things that it cannot do just because it occupies state power. And for example, we are having right now a lot of discussions in various areas regarding social movements, for example, education. And it's very easy to see that in this specific setting, where you have, for example, a person who's connected to the government, the point of view that they will have of the situation will probably be close to the first quadrant, in the sense that we have certain actors in education, and then we have to find a way to either get rid of them or to keep them at bay. And then the emancipation is always treated in the terms of the infighting between certain groups. But if you are talking with, like, for example, a group of teachers who are involved in experimental schools, etc., they might find that the whole problem is dealing with the problem of education in structural terms. That in a sense, you are over rationalizing, and the only form of like of dealing with the problem of education is like undoing these reforms that are happening at the government level. So we would have, like, from this point of view, these two different groups would be talking past each other necessarily. So I wonder if there is a way to not only code these relations, but also to understand the transformations between each points in a way that allows us to understand also how each type of group is not only talking past each other, but how they can how they can get back to a certain form of constructing cooperatively without each having to, like, to simply be subsumed to the other one's point of view. I don't know.
So I have a general question. Maybe this is a little bit off, but I see in this both an ontology and an epistemology. Which point of view are we pushing forward? Are we saying that these relationships are relationships that actually do exist, and, like, for example, the way that Karatani explains goes through certain periods throughout the history, but they do exist, so it's a sort of ontology of what is happening, or the actual concrete relations of agents and actors and relationships and stuff like that? Or is it a way of interpreting what is going on?
I think I have a related comment to Reza, because I was thinking also like how wait, I just forgot what I was going to say. Yeah. How, like, I think the move is also in terms of from like, I think it's mentioned some in the glossary, right? No, I don't remember. It's between description and prescription, right? And it's interesting. I think that's one of the reasons why it can be useful to us, is because it moves from like a sort of like general methodology of like theoretical methodology that, you know, like you end up having like a philosophy of history and so on. But it goes, it treads towards also like a political implicated like consequences. So you move from like a descriptive to, you're actually trying to articulate, I think, how a description of social reality relates to a sort of prescriptive or like political take on the social, right? So it's and it has this sort of like also scalar thing where this distinction, this continuity is useful both for like theoreticians and for like militants. And I think it's I totally agree with what Rafael was saying, that I mean the problem is that it's really hard to explain this diagram. Like takes a lot of time to like, you have to like fill in, because I thought it was rhetorical in the beginning, like when I first saw it, but you actually have to fill in like what conjunctural means in like the one, because it means a different thing in each. Like I feel like this each like term has to be filled in with like concrete yeah, it has to be sort of like fleshed out for stuff to get for you to get like concrete transformations between each terms. But I think it would be really cool to actually make them try to understand like what in political organization and political thinking and like actual tendencies this could help like map out differences between both organization and sort of like orientations in general. but yeah.
Just so I can, because I think this is like very crappy drawing. But I think that there's the missing element in this diagram is that, for example, there is a conjunctural domination, for example, in the first one, and a conjunctural emancipation, but they are structurally related in the sense that the relations between domination and emancipation precede what domination and emancipation is. The same goes for quadrant 4, where there's a homogeneity. So the effect of a homogeneity is that there is a structural relation between domination and emancipation. But the inverse applies to conjunctural and structural in the sense that the terms domination and emancipation precede their relation. And that's why we can have heterogeneous elements here. So I think that that addresses, in a sense, part of what you're saying, right, Renzo? But I do agree that it's we would have to work out still, like, what does it mean going from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 2 to 3, in the sense. But getting back to what you said, Renzo, between is this ontological or is this epistemological? I think this is ontological, and I don't know, maybe I'm getting the terms wrong, but I would say that this is ontological in the sense that this point of view, these problems, I think these sets of relations, they are visible from the point of view of our theory of social atoms. So I would say that it's not simply a manner of it's not, I would say it's not simply a manner of saying that these are different forms of viewing history. Because if it were simply that, I think this diagram would be like, pick your poison. But it's not exactly that. Because if we look at the structure, we have, I'll try and draw, but this I think it's very hard.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're drawing. It sounds like exactly to me. The description here, although it's not clear, but it looks like what you said, pick your poison. Because, for example, coming back to Karatani's mode A's, A, B, C, and D are clearly ontological. I mean, he's saying that there are things that are happening throughout history, and those things have these structures, right? Whereas it seems here we are saying that there is a certain way of seeing real relationships under quadrant 1, Wallerstein, or under Sohnredl, or under number 3, which I don't know who the and then under what SDP is saying. But we are looking at the same phenomenon ontologically, but within different interpretations. And that is why we can keep things from 1 and 2 and 3, because these are different interpretations. How else can we keep things from 1 or 2 or 3, right?
But let me see if I understood. We can only keep things from 1, from 2, and from 3. The things that the relational aspects of each of these terms. This is what I was because if you look at what we have like, for example, this structure where it's not symmetrical in any sense. Because, for example, here we have relational term in the 4th quadrant, we have relational terms we have relational domination, relational structure, and the relation between domination and emancipation is also relational. In the first one, we have the terms of domination. The domination and emancipation are defined in terms of concrete terms, but the relation between domination and emancipation is relational. So I think that it's not a matter of simply, I think that there's an ontological element that it would not be ontological if, for example, you simply decided which point of view you want to approach, and depending on the point of view, you see more or less. And if there was no way of between these three or four options, there was no, okay, so none of these can exhaust the field. So sometimes we're going to do world systems theory, sometimes we're going to do real abstraction, sometimes we'll do Negrianism, and sometimes we will do STP. So just correct me if I'm wrong, Reza, but this would be like the epistemological point of view of this diagram, right?
Yes, it could. That would be one epistemological, but at the same time, you can say, I'm looking at the same phenomenon, which is capitalism, and then I can look at it through word system theory, or I can look at it through value form theory, or I can look at it through Negri, or I can look at it through STP. So it doesn't have to be what you're saying is definitely one way of understanding how the epistemological approach works, but it doesn't have to be the only way. You can also say this, but underlying all this is one state of affair, which is capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So another way of saying this is, it is not like, the reason I'm asking this, let me finish up here. So another way of saying this, it is not like we have four historical modes, 1, 2, 3, 4, like the way Karatani is saying.
Yeah.
These are four different ways of looking at the same historical mode. The reason that it's important for me to understand this is when we are talking about the movement among these. So when we talk about movement, we are talking about movement of one methodology to another methodology, or movement from one historical era to another historical era altogether.
Oh, okay.
Again, that was a little bit confusing to me.
No, okay, I think I understood but please, if you want to say more, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I think I understood more your point. I think that in a sense, this diagram is not it's not they are describing the same phenomena as you said. So these would be like, you could say that these are four different epistemological approaches. So I can agree with that. But what I would say, and I think it meshes maybe with something that Renzo just said in the chat, but I wouldn't be I wouldn't have really strong justifications. But I think that since these positions are operations in social political thinking, since they are in a sense political points of view and not simply descriptions of social reality that are neutral, there might be different decisions in regards to what is considered structural, relational, and what is considered conjunctural, or, for example, indefinable terms. So I think that the first thing is, I agree, I think that there are different there are different decisions to the same phenomena that would be capitalism, for example. But I think that when we look at these different frameworks, I think that the form of organizing these different frameworks in this specific manner, it seems to me that they are indebted to a decision on what this social reality is, in a sense. I don't think if you take, for example, if imagine if there was a world where there was only world systems theorists and real abstraction theorists, I don't think that they would oppose themselves in this way. So, and I also don't think that what would be relevant for the description of social capitalism, they might not be able to see that, for example, one of them sees domination and emancipation in strictly concrete terms, and the other sees structural domination being opposed to a conjunctural emancipation. So in a sense, I agree. I think that there are different frameworks for the description and prescription of social reality that involve different decisions onto what is ontological and what is epistemological. And I think that appears, for example, in the idea that when we talk about world systems theory, it's a problem of demystification, of identifying the powers at hand that conduct concrete forms of domination, and the way, and identifying also the paths of the concrete paths of emancipation, the concrete actors that are relevant for facing these concrete actors of domination. So I agree that there's a decision in how to do this, but I would also see, and this is like just yeah, I think Dennis said more clearly where I was going. I don't think that we are able to see this fourfold structure without the theory of social atoms and social logic that is at the basis of this essay. Because even if this is presented first, I think that the sense of structural, the structural element, what it actually means, is only visible through the idea of social logic. And in a sense, there you go, there's a ontological grounding, if so, because it's not simply a matter, it goes from there are 4 ways to describe capitalism to there are 4 ways of describing capitalism, because not all of the forms of describing capitalism account in the same manner for the aspects of social logics. Because, for example, this is, and this is, I think that is one of the interesting and important elements in this essay. When we look at, for example, quadrants 2 and 3, we can only see that they have like polar opposite philosophical histories of philosophies of history, in the sense that one goes from well, all we can do is put a brake on reality, and the other is all we can do is accelerate our forms of rationality and disseminate them as much as we can. If you look at them in these terms, this is like an endless conundrum. If you look at them only from this point of view, we can only manage to see how this conundrum ends once we understand, yeah, I think there's an antinomy in this sense. While I don't think, for example, there is an antinomy between points 1 and 4. Yeah, I'm not Hegelian enough to continue that, but I do think that, for example, there is an antinomy between structural domination and between 2 and 3, in the sense that from themselves alone, you cannot decide which is the best path because they simply invert one another. But I think that this would be one point where this antinomy is visible only once we get to do the Aufhebung of point one. That is, once we are able to recuperate that the 3 and 2 are solutions to a problem in one, but in attempting those solutions, they leave out aside a crucial element in point one, which should be preserved, which is the structural relation between domination and emancipation. So I do agree that these are different frameworks, but I think that if they were simply open frameworks that present losses and benefits, we would not be able to construct a larger point of view which is able to preserve certain elements from all three of them without losing anything. I think that's the point, I think. Please.
Yeah, so I guess at what point is it that we have 3 different kind of places or 4 different kind of places that we maneuver between, and which could then like be epistemology versus we have like an actual meta theory, or a theory that has more to say than the earlier theories and can do the thing which seems closer to ontology in science, which is like account for earlier theories. Because when I look at the diagram, it doesn't seem like 4 equal places. It seems like 3 wrong places and 1 place from which to correctly see why the other 3 are wrong, which would then be a scientific position and closer to ontology. Because really, like, what we are saying is that 4 is right and the other 3 are wrong. We're not saying they're equal.
Yes.
At all. We are saying that it makes sense why a lot of political dialogue and strategization fails, because most of the positions of the discourse are occupying 1, 2, or 3, and they are, like Raphael was saying, speaking past each other. But I do think we have a strong stake in saying that 4 is right, 1, 2, and 3 are ultimately incorrect, even if they have useful information. And that's not unlike a lot of sciences, right? Where you can like suspend the correct perspective of a higher order theory like relativity and operate in what we now know as a local theory, like the Newtonian physics we learned in high school, right? We can still do physics in that. It still produces really useful results, but we know it's wrong from like a meta theoretical perspective, but we don't think that they're equal either, right? Like, and they're not. Maybe I don't know as much of the epistemology versus ontology debates in philosophy. So maybe there are arguments that Newtonian physics versus Einstein is epistemology, but from just my background, that seems more ontological. So I don't know. But it does seem like what we are making strong arguments that we have a correct position and that the other positions are limited, even if they have localizable or validities. And so yeah, it seems like we're doing ontology at this point, not epistemology, even if we can account for epistemologies. And this diagram is ultimately making a strong claim about ontologies.
So I think that what you said was very good, because I think it cleared a lot, at least in my mind, and about how we should approach these differences, because it's exactly that. This would be a meaningless diagram, and that's why I think Reza's concern is very important. This would be a meaningless diagram if it seemed like these were only different frameworks, different points of view to the same social phenomenon. So I think that part of the work of the essay, and this is something that I think is developed through the essay, and that is clear only once we understand how the point of view of the social atom allows us to encompass all aspects is that there is a sense in which each of these three first positions is correct. So the first step is identifying in which sense they are correct. In which sense does conjunctural domination and conjunctural emancipation describe reality in a meaningful manner? In what sense does structural domination and conjunctural emancipation describe reality in a meaningful manner? And in what sense does conjunctural domination and structural emancipation describe reality in a meaningful manner? So if we take, for example, structural domination and conjunctural emancipation, I agree with Renzo, there is a political wager in this decision. It's not simply a neutral description of state of affairs. We have a wager that describing social reality, social domination structurally allows us to see more than if we described it as a simple conjunctural dimension. So, for example, the fact is the world of real abstraction, or the fact that when you understand the logic of real abstraction, you describe more than simply describing with the terms. Oh, you have a company. I mean, of course I'm characterizing world systems theories, but it's not, you describe more as more, you touch on more things in social reality when you develop the commodity logic, when you simply describe and localize the actors present in commodity logic. So in a sense, we are able to see that from world systems theories to real abstraction, there is something that you describe that allows you to see more of social reality. So in a sense, it's not that simply we are taking random elements. There is a specific aspect of domination that we are describing, which is social reality is best described through a form, through a logic. And the same can be said of conjunctural domination and structural emancipation. We can describe more forms of emancipation if we are able to present a structural description, a structural account of prescription, and not simply a conjunctural account of emancipation. So there is something very concrete that we gain from quadrants 2 and quadrants 3. So if we go from 1 to 2, there's something specific we gain. If we go from 1 to 3, there's something specific we gain. But when you go from 1 to 2 or from 1 to 3, there is an antinomy. How do you decide which is the best description of social reality? Because the drawback of going from 1 to 2 and from 1 to 3 is that you either go towards an enlightened, rational organization of society, or it's a endless insurrectionalism. How do you decide between the two? There's not enough between them to decide. So they are not complete accounts, I would say, of the situation. And this is where there's an element of one that must be preserved, which is the homogeneity. If we understand that structural domination and structural emancipation are themselves also related structurally, then we arrive at a more complete view. But what is this point of view, and why is it not simply epistemological? Because I think that it is our wager in this essay and also in STP, I would guess. I don't know I'm curious, but it's that through social atoms, you have a form of accounting for forms of domination. So it's not simply concrete domination, but you are account for multiple forms of domination. But you are also able to account for multiple forms of emancipation, in the sense that it is not simply emancipation and domination are not opposed and are not qualitatively different terms. Please, Renzo.
Yeah. Well, one thing I maybe realized is that, and yeah, maybe I don't know if we should move on because we're quite a long time in the first slide, but yeah, yeah, I think what it's something I realize is that it's also interesting to think about the quadrants in terms of what is the measure that accounts for the difference between domination and emancipation in each quadrant. And in the first and let's start from in the second and third, the difference is sort of like you have a sort of like one term carries what's the sort of like the there's a sort of like sort of like substantial difference between what's logical and reasonable and what's not. So you have to go out. So you either on two, you either the measure is like the domination is the sort of like sorry, structure is on the side of domination. So you have to get out of it. So the point of view of the logical, what's logical and what's structural is on the side of domination. You have to get out of that. And out of that is sort of like destruction or critique and so on. In the third, what's reasonable, what's logical is on the side of emancipation of the political body. So so the measure is I mean, two and three both rely on sort of like some sort of like idealistic difference that has to be posited, right? There has to be some sort of like criteria in which in the case of third you step onto like a rational space, and I mean the main operator is sorting, and on the second one you don't have a rational criteria, but you because reason is on the side of domination, so the only way to step out is destruction. And I think 1 and 4, these differences cannot be sort of like seeked into this sort of like rational and irrational, because you have like homogeneous term. So the criteria on the first is, so you're both on both sides you have like concrete stuff. So the only criteria you can have, the measure, is sort of like concrete gains. So when you have like concrete gains, then you have progress, then you have sort of like, and that's why it feels like reformist. So you have to sort of like assess concrete gains. I think that's the measure. While the second, the measure is sort of like what's lost, like destruction, and the third, the measure is sort of like rational, some sort of like ideals that are sort of like maintained and sort of like developed. While on 4, the measure is not concrete, because you cannot find this sort of like positive difference because both terms are homogeneous. But the difference is not concrete, it's abstract. So, and the difference in like the way that we talked about is like which structure is richer, right? So it's not about like concrete gains, it's about sort of the richness of communism is not like it's a richer version of social structure. It's something in which so the measure is a different notion, I think. So I think it's also just realize that thinking in terms of how one delimitates and measure the difference between domination and emancipation is also like changes across quadrants. Yeah.
I think there's a very good thing you said, because if you take into account, like, we could say that a measure of success in the fourth quadrant would be the ability of the dominant social logic to be regionalized into a case, right? From what you were saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's you can also like think in terms of like the topology, like you have like a social body. In the two, the sort of like social body encloses a sort of like political body and has the sort of like high end. On the third one, the political body has the sort of like high end, but it's sort of like ideal. And in four, what's the ways you have to invert the sort of like it's when the political body becomes the environment. So and when it becomes the environment, it sort of like engulfs the social. And so the sort of capitalism becomes just like a located organ, something like that, within the space. So I think one is sort of like before any scission between politics and between sort of like political and social. And 2 and 3 operates with some sort of like scission, but it's problematic. And 4 sort of like resolves that sort of like this a priori difference by having it's an imminent measure of difference, I think, 4. And while 2 and 3 you have this some sort of like idealistic, or no, I don't know how to call it, but I feel it posits differences, but it doesn't have a sort of internal criteria, because you have to step outside in both 2 and 3. You have to step outside of either towards destruction or towards ideals. And in 4, you're able to generate a sort of like immanent model, which is not something just empirical, like gains, as in 1, but you're able to assess by a sort of like logical capacity of like the expressive power of language, or in the way that we use, or the richness of the social complexity and so on. I don't know if that makes sense. But...
No, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think, at least for me, it really helps envision something that Vitor just said in the chat. I think he's not here right now, but he said, like, it's about how things are and not how we should look at them. Because in a sense, we could say, okay, so it's very easy. If you only consider the terms of domination and then the terms of emancipation, it's a reformist point of view, as I said, because all you're going to get is what, in a sense, you already have, right? And there's like simple steps of generalizing structural domination and conjunctural domination, and structural domination and structural emancipation, but at the cost of constructing that qualitative difference that you pointed out. So we could say, if there was a reviewer number 2 here, we could say, okay, so why don't you simply go from 1 to 4? Like, okay, you have the forms of, you have conjunctural forms of domination, and then you have conjunctural forms of emancipation, and they relate imminently. Why don't you simply abstract away domination, or as Gabriel started saying, abstract into domination and abstract into emancipation? Because, and I think this leads us to the point where it's not simply how we look at them, but about how things are. It's not so easy to construct a description or an analysis of these points in a way that domination is structural, that emancipation is structural, and that the relation between domination and emancipation is itself structural. This is something that I think is only possible through the theory of social atoms. The theory of social atoms. So I think that if we stay at this point, we have either two things to say. Either it's like different points of view to the same problem, or well, if it's so simple, why has it not been tried out? I mean, it's very easy to say that, for example, like we are all postmodernists, at least historically saying, so difference, relationality, these are all like primary criteria for us rather than fixed terms. So why not just have from the start, why not be like Spinoza and arrive at God with only 11 propositions? Well, I think the problem is that constructing a model of social reality that allows us to treat domination, emancipation, and the relation between these terms in a structural manner is the difficult point. And that is why it is not enough to simply treat relationally domination. Because if you only treat relationally domination, there is only one form of emancipation. And if you treat emancipation structurally, you are unable to see the different rationalities that abound in domination. I don't know if this is making more sense, but I think that the difficult part here is constructing a model that allows us to preserve these three elements. And this is the idea of social atoms. So do we take like a 5-minute break here, or what do you guys think?
I mean, we've been here about 2 hours. I think probably just, yeah, like 20 minutes more, and then I think we just call it a day, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think we will probably need more meetings if we want to finish this. So
Okay.
I would do a couple more meetings and then.
Yeah, we do have the next two open, but I don't know if I would be available to shepherd that meeting in the next two due to work stuff. But I'm not against having other meetings of. I think it's very good actually, and I think it was never the goal to finish it. But we can decide that afterwards. So as I've said, like in the essay, we go through we understand this problem, we tackle it through the notion of world. So we try to understand what is a world in each of those quadrants. So especially in the first and the second quadrant. So if we take into account world systems theory, a world can be described as this encompassing structure that is delimited, that is delimited, that is limited off through specific concrete forms of interaction. So trade routes, limits of transportation of certain commodity, certain legal systems and their positive jurisdiction, forms of international organization, treaties, states, etc. And a world is not only defined through those types of limits, but they also, and this is something that is important for us, I think, they account for a world in the terms of a certain self-reproducing structure. So, okay, bye, Raza. So a world is not simply it's not the globe. A world is very very strictly defined by world systems theorists as a structure that is enough for the self-reproduction of what is inside that structure. But where world systems theorists define the limits of these structures through the limits of certain types of concrete interactions. Real abstraction theories, value form theories, such as by John, real abstraction theories such as in value form theories such as on Reto will account for this world through a certain logic. So the logic of commodity form is a logic that will enact a social synthesis. So a social synthesis would be a synthesis that constructs this self-reproducing corner of social reality. So in a sense, it's very clear from both of these positions, that a social world is something that describes a self-reproducing set of elements. But on one hand, we have these sets of elements described through their concrete interactions. So that would be like a vulgar materialist point of view, like where the problem is demystifying and identifying those points. And the other approach would be in working out the specific logic that makes different types of interactions intelligible. So it's very interesting when we look at these three points of view, because social world theory, world systems theories, allows us to see the composition and the interaction of parts of a world, but there is no intelligibility of this structure. It is not logically thought out. While on the other hand, when we look at the Zomrethelian point of view, we do get to think this world. There is an intelligibility to it. And we can also split it into parts. But I don't think this has been justified. But I would say that from the value form theorist point of view, it is not possible to account for the genesis of this social role, especially due to the fact that you tend to focus on one type, on real abstraction, the value form, which is what binds social synthesis. It is thought out as the only form of rationality. So what we attempt to do, when this is in a sense a generalizing of Zomrethelian position, is starting out from this logical approach, which is from Logics of World, which is particular situations, logical contexts. They will allow us to see particular. Each social world will be visible according to a certain logic. So when we are able to see the differences that make difference, we are able to approach a social world and understand how it consists. So there are certain conditions that would allow us to see this logic that are worked out in the part 5 of the essay, which is first, there is an analytic component. So one must be able to define atomic granularity of that context beyond which differences do not make a difference. So there is like a minimum element of this world, where beyond this element, it's not all types of interactions that have sense in this world. When we talk of a logical binding of a world, it's important to note that this there is a limit between where there's a certain where a certain point allows us to give sense to this world, and differences behind or beyond this element they do not make a difference. And these specific atoms, they have to have, there's this analytic point, which is the granularity. It's the minimal component of a certain world. But these also must have the power to generate new atoms. So they have to have a synthetic aspect. They are not only a minimal part, but it must be possible to build from these minimal parts, from compatible atoms, new atoms. And the atomic differences that make a difference in that context must be supported and propagated by a substrate that is essential or indifferent or reducible to it. Its material basis. So in that aspect, we have, for example, we can take, for example, the minimal aspects in the logic of reciprocity, which is an important which is one of the social logics that we deal with. As we see in Levi-Strauss's discussions of social affinity, of gift giving and intercourse and structures of social relationships, of kinship. For example, blood is a good atom, a good substrate to propagate certain differences in a way that it is in itself indifferent to these differences. And this is very important because, for example, when you take Levi-Strauss into account, I think the big wow element there is that the fact that forms of kinship propagate through blood does not mean that blood itself is kinship. This is an Aiken structure to the fact that, for example, gold and silver are prime candidates for being substrates to value in capitalist societies. There are material aspects in this element that allow it to be propagated, that allow it to propagate certain differences. So when we are approaching these logical structures, we first have to account for these three conditions, right? There's an analytic component. Oh, I'm raising my own hands. There's an analytic component. So there is like a certain minimal level of sense in this world. This minimal level still has to be able to build new elements, new atomic elements, and these have to be supported by a substrate that is indifferent. So if we take, for example, the logic of kinship, I think that is a bit more visible since I already used it as an example. For example, there is a minimal component like the relations between a mother and daughter, between friends and enemies. There are minimal relations that they can generate new relations. For example, you can have there are marriages between tribes, and through these marriages, the daughter belongs both to different families, and these have different effects depending on the organizing structures of these two groups. But the fact is that we have a minimal level of difference. These minimal levels of differences are able to generate new atoms, and there is a material basis for this difference. For example, it's accounted for through the blood differences. They are not in themselves senseful. They don't have sense in themselves. Like blood is not enough, but it is through blood that these differences make a difference. So when we can say that the conditions for having a logical structure are those three, but we are also able to say that the coherence, when we abide for this structure, these 3 points, we are able to say that there is a regional coherence, but this does not mean that this guarantees that these global spaces will be closed off. This is not enough. So I'm wondering, since people are leaving because of the time, I think maybe we should stop here and pick up from the discussion on the logics of social world. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree. And you
Because
did a really good job of describing this up until this point. And I think you could even, based on what you said, like connect this slide back to the previous discussion about the 4 quadrants, because I feel like if we really abide to these conditions, we should be able to specify what, like how they map to these terms of conjunctural and structural, right? Like it almost seems like basically something like the material basis condition corresponds to the conjunctural, and the analytic maybe corresponds to the analytic, and synthetic correspond to the structural, something like that.
And maybe the other conditions correlate to the relation between domination and emancipation, to the
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're binding the two, because maybe one like structural versus conjunctural, they only can take one side of this relation. But if we can put them together, if we can put the analytic and the synthetic together, which we do with this idea of the atom,
yeah,
then we are like affecting a gluing of the two structural dimensions here.
yeah, and I think that, and now that you said it allows us also to understand why maybe point 1 is already in a sense glued, because if it is conjunctural, if it's already at the material level.
Yeah, exactly. If it material glues to material, right?
Yeah, so it's already in a sense it's a poor point of view, but it's glued, so there's it as a world more easily, maybe.
Yeah, I guess the open question there is like, what is the difference between the glue in quadrant 1 and the glue in quadrant 4, right?
Yeah.
I think it's like what you were saying, that in quadrant 1 it's terms, and then their glue is relational. In quadrant 4, we're also saying the glue is relational, right? But now the terms have become relations. So it's like, yeah, maybe it's not so much different in quality, like it's a relational glue in both cases, but it's the fact that we're now gluing relations rather than terms. So in our case, like instead of, we're not aiming to glue material processes together. That's already happening.
Yes.
We're aiming to glue the logics together.
Yes, I think that's a really good way to close out, because now that you said it, it even makes it clear, I think, the difficulties of presenting the 4th quadrant, because you can't, because since the logics have to be glued, you have to construct the way in which they are glued. So you have to be able to account for the relationships between the different social logics.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important that we define the terms, like define this transcendental point of view, because I feel like when you have a transcendental point of view, you're basically saying, this is what I care about. Like everything outside of this, I don't care about. Only the things within this specific region are like you said, they're differences that make a difference. So without that regionalizing move, you can never really specify how you're going to glue things together. So it's kind of a necessary step that we regionalize in order to connect connect these relations together, you know.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that really makes clear, I think, and it really helps, I think, understand that last point, which is it's not simply an epistemological approach in the sense that it's simply a point of view or an interpretation of social phenomena. There are real elements of social reality that also help us understand these different this last point of view, the fourth point of view.
Yeah, because we want to break out of that hermeneutical thing of like we're only just like adding more points of view to things. We want to say like we want to take a step back and say like what are the conditions to, you know, actually building something together. You know, like creating new forms from these relations. So there's some kind of conditioning happening. Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit late to figure it all out now, but
no, but I think it's something that we stumbled when we were doing the text, and we didn't even work out, I think, these possible interactions, especially because it was very fast. But now that we're talking here, I think there's an aspect which is good to flesh out.
yeah, exactly. I would say like we will flesh it out when we discover the necessity of our quadrant.
Yeah.
With respect to the other three, and it's not so much that we are just adding on another, you know, +1, and there could be a fifth position and a sixth position here. It has to somehow be the if I would use in a category theory language, it would be like a universal position with respect to these three other positions. Something which is like logically the minimal form of a solution to the problems posed by the other three.
Oh, this, yeah, and I think that there's I wonder if there's also a way to like, but this would be also opening up another path, which would be a sort of backtracking, where from the theory of social atoms, we might be able to explain the specific points where the relation of domination and emancipation falls into quadrant 1 or quadrant 2 or quadrant 3. So what is specifically is left out of the gluing so that emancipation is treated conjuncturally and domination structurally? What is left out for, you know, I don't know if that makes sense, but I wonder if like this would be like a meta theory of the fetishization inside the theory itself. But I wonder if there are aspects in this logic of social atoms that also help understand why these other three quadrants may also appear. What are the conditions for each of them?
Yeah, that's a really good, I think that's how we should approach it next time. Like basically define what is their version of an atom. Like maybe they wouldn't call it an atom, but like what is their solution to gluing the material with the logical? Because they have some way of gluing, like in the case of quadrant 3, they're taking some material process, which is the conjunctural domination, and they're gluing it to some structural emancipation in some way by saying that this is how you break out of it, this material process. Yeah, so then I think that's how we should focus on it, like you're saying, defining what the glue is, and how it's different. But now we're the only two left, so
yeah,
we'll need to leave it for next time.
Yeah, but it was great. So thanks, great seeing you, Dennis.
Yeah, take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.